Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Tunes Toons Issues, where I, your resident Blerd, Avery, talk about all things cartoons, comic books, music, and just all things nerdy. Today, I'm really excited because not only is this the first ever episode of the podcast, but it's going to be an episode talking about one of my favorite shows, and that is Craig of the Creek. So, without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Created by Matt Burnett and Ben Levin, Craig of the Creek aired its first episode on March 30th of 2018 on Cartoon Network, running for 5 seasons before coming to an end on July 14th of 2023. The show follows Craig, our main character, and his 2 best friends Kelsey and JP as they have different adventures in their neighborhood creek. The creek is full of different kids and cliques. You've got your horse girls, your anime weebs, your science nerds, your capitalist who runs a trading post. Yeah, I don't know. Craig of the Creek is honestly such a refreshing show. I mean, it's not always you really get to see like black main characters in cartoons. It's not often you get to see black main characters, period. But more specifically in animation, black people are kind of often relegated to being their normal stereotypical roles that they would be if they were in live action. But it's really nice to see that there is a show there was a show that was out there that allowed young black boys and young black children as a whole, because there's more than just black male representation in that show, that gets to see themselves represented on TV and get to see them doing fun and crazy cool things that they probably wouldn't have been able to see a couple of years ago. I know for me, even as like a teenager when this show originally aired, this show honestly just was so good, and it really touched my heart because it's literally my childhood on screen, and I think that's why I resonate with it so much. But when it comes to popularity, I feel like this show, it had a decent following and it aired for like 5 seasons, so it was doing pretty well. But I think in terms of like public discussion, I feel like this show was often kind of not talked about as much. And this is where I kind of want to take a second to talk about something specifically to the black community. So if you're not black, hey, back up, take a second, maybe close your ears, because it isn't for you. I mean, if you want to listen, who cares? But maybe just step back. Yep. A little further. Yep. Right there. Okay. Cover your ears. Thank you. I've seen some posts online about how some people in the black community were a little disturbed to find out that this show was originally created by 2 white men, as they believed that if they wanted to have black stories and black people represented on screen, it should also be reflected in its creators and in its staff. And while I think that critique is very valid, I feel like it really undermines the amount of black talent that was behind the screen. Because while yes, there were 2 white men who were the creators of the show, you can see throughout the show and in the credits that there are plenty of black voice actors, plenty of black writers within that room that were making sure that that content came out and accurately reflected and depicted black people. And that's not to say that those critiques that people have made are wrong. I just wanted to say that I think that there's room for both forms of representation, of having representation where white people may create the show, but there's still cultural accuracy and there's still black people behind the creation, as well as purely black made, black represented, and black casted art. I say all this to say that while I myself enjoyed the show, I can recognize and want to acknowledge the critiques that people in my community have, because I think it's important to have these conversations when it comes to Black representation. And if I can do anything with this podcast, it's create a space where we as Black people and even other marginalized people can have safe conversations, because it's not always easy to have conversations about race or any other marginalized group when in fandom spaces, because a lot of the times they are predominantly white. And so I hope by me talking about this and me sharing my opinion, you can gain some insight into this podcast, how it's going to go, and how I want to run it. Anyways, non-Black people, you can take your hands off your ears. You can come back. It's safe to come back. Anyways, let's get back into the episode. One of my favorite things about the show is the ways in which they develop their characters. Like most slice of life cartoons, the show is pretty episodic. It doesn't always reference itself unless it's doing like a part 2, or maybe there's just like a joke that they're making that calls for them to call back to a specific part. But every now and then we get an episode that focuses on a specific character or relationship that just adds a little bit more of dimension to these characters and gives us a little further insight on their lives outside the creek. Like, honestly, some of my favorite episodes are when Craig and the gang aren't even at the creek. So, today we'll be doing the character breakdown, where I'll be analyzing our 3 main characters and discussing who they are, their personalities, and how much they've grown throughout the show. First up is John Paul Mercer, or more commonly known, JP, our first stump kid. He is truly the comic relief of the show. He's incredibly funny, and half the time when you're laughing at a joke from the show, it's because of him. He's either doing the setup, he is delivering the punchline, maybe he is the punchline, who knows. But in some way, shape, or form, he's one of the main reasons as to why the show is so entertaining. But I wanted to take a little bit to talk about how he's grown throughout the show, because initially he's portrayed as like your very typical comic relief character. He's very funny, he's got a very goofy personality, but when it comes to social situations, while yes, he is very good at speaking to people and making friends, he's kind of socially unaware and seems to kind of be living in his own world a lot of the times. And many of the characters for our main characters or background characters who interact with him make plenty of different comments about him and his character. And if your alarm bells are starting to sound off, yes, JP is neurodivergent. While it's never outwardly stated, there's an episode in the first season titled Juxtaterrestrial in which JP is convinced that he's an alien after his sister Laura makes an offhand comment that he must be inhuman, the way he can miraculously heal from these bizarre and weird injuries that he seems to always get. Looking back on the episode, it's honestly kind of sad. JP is in middle school, and it's important to note that a lot of the characters within the creek, especially our main characters, are of elementary school age, and there's an underlying theme throughout the show that kids, once they reach a certain age, are supposed to start rejecting kind of what the creek represents, like this childlike wonder and all these games and fantasy that these kids really live in, which I will touch on later. But JP is notably, I believe, like around 11 or 12. I don't know if he's actually given a specific age throughout the show. And then Craig, I believe, is 9 and Kelsey is 8. And throughout the show, it's just subtly implied that his position in the creek kind of doesn't make sense because of how old he is. But even JP seems to be aware of that disconnect between him and a lot of his peers, and this episode really takes that concept and like shoves it in your face. throughout the entire episode, JP is trying to make contact with aliens because he believes that that might be his true family, and if he can get in contact with them, they can come down and they can take him away to this home planet that he seems to be from, and just take him to a place where he could be understood, which is really sad to think about at like 11 or 12 years old, that you feel so disconnected from people that you have to just not be human, and that there's somebody out there who's waiting to just find you and take you away so you can finally feel like comfortable as yourself. But this episode isn't a complete bummer, because by the end of the episode he has another conversation with his sister, and she looks at him and is like, hey, when I told you weren't human, I wasn't being literal. I was more of a metaphor, and two, that it's okay to feel as though you're different from others, because you are. Your brain may not work the same, but that doesn't put you at a disadvantage, and you shouldn't let other people treat you as such. I think that's a great message for children and adults, and I'm really glad that there's a show that can take the time to really reassure them and tell them that it's okay to be different, because it is. But what I find even more impressive about the show is not only do they take the time to really represent neurodivergency, they also do a good job at subverting typical tropes surrounding neurodivergent characters. Just 5 episodes earlier, JP's accused of being a liar after claiming to have found the largest crayfish in the creek, to which he named Big Pinchy and claimed to be the size of a whale. Throughout the episode, they try searching for Big Pinchy to have some sort of evidence, but it's noticeable that Craig seems to be a lot more angered by the disrespect than even JP is. And it leads to a confrontation in which JP reveals that he was never once affected by the comment and simply wanted to go on this expedition to find Big Pinchy because he just wanted to share that experience with his friends. Which is just such a sweet revelation, but is also an amazing decision made by the writers. Because if we're going to acknowledge the idea that JP is neurodivergent, the fact that he is a character who is extremely self-confident, I think really does a great job of subverting, again, typical tropes for neurodivergent characters. While I myself am not neurodivergent, so it's possible that I could be speaking out of place, and if so, please correct me. But I think a lot of the times when there are characters who are supposed to represent neurodivergent people, they often are, or at least a lot of shows take the time to really show how their neurodivergency can be a really big hindrance, and a lot of their arc is about overcoming that, and how they sort of start to gain their confidence with their neurodivergency. But with JB, his sense of identity truly has never wavered at all, and I think to have this episode so early in the show's runtime, and to show like how self-confident JP is already at such a young age. Again, he's supposed to be only like 11 or 12. I think that's truly incredible, and I think it's just a testament to how committed these writers are into giving accurate representation for neurodivergent people. Next up is Kelsey Pokaling. And let me tell you something. Kelsey is a fantasy nerd. She loves to read and write fantasy. She's even like equipped with her trusty sword made out of a PVC pipe. And she even has a trusty little animal companion named Mortimer that is a parakeet. There's even like a running gag within the show where Kelsey has like this internal monologue to the point where like the world goes into black and white and there's like a single spotlight on her, which is just like a really good example of the show and how it takes advantage of the medium of animation. Like, this show does a really good job of exaggerating reality to kind of represent how the children perceive the world, and it's never on display as much as when it's with Kelsey. Like, she just has such a control over her own reality. It's hilarious. But I have to say, one of my favorite episodes with Kelsey is when they actually pull back on the theatrics. There's an episode in season 1 called Alone Quest, where Craig and JP have to leave Kelsey alone in the the creek due to an emergency. So Kelsey takes the day to enjoy herself. She indulges in some of the things she kind of can't really do with Craig and JP around. She finishes writing her first ever fantasy novel. She also lets a fat one rip. But I think my favorite scene from the episode is when Kelsey is by the creek and she's cleaning off her sword when a squirrel above her knocks out some leaves from a tree, and she almost kind of like instinctively bats it out of the way with her sword, and she starts to follow the squirrel as it continues to jump from tree branch to tree branch, and she just keeps striking at the leaves that are falling until she runs into a meadow with a huge hill. And so she just takes the time to roll down the hill and laugh, and when she gets to the bottom, she says this really interesting line, which is, "It's a beautiful day, Mom." Earlier in this season, it is revealed in an episode titled The Takeout Mission that Kelsey's mother has passed away. And it's almost like a throwaway line. In the episode, Craig and JP are picking up Kelsey from her house to go to the creek when a storm rolls in, and the gang is forced to stay inside. Later, they're all in Kelsey's room, and when Craig mentions Kelsey's book collection, she says that they were her mom's before she passed. But I think the saddest and also the most beautiful part is that all the books are fantasy. And while this scene is mostly a way to give some quick exposition on Kelsey and her personal life, it does so much to flesh out her character. Like, to find out that her love of fantasy stems from her mom just like makes Kelsey so much more three-dimensional. It's like, this is really just like a little girl who lost her mother but is still finding a way to connect to her even though she's gone. Last, but certainly not least, is the Craig of the Creek. Craig Williams is our main character and has all the classic hallmarks of a protagonist. He's adventurous, he's extremely empathetic even to those who harm him or try to hurt him, and he's also really kind. A lot of like the shenanigans that the group really gets up to in a lot of the episodes are usually due to Craig's like altruistic nature or his need to explore. While he never really does anything specifically for fame or gratitude, when he's given it, Craig can kind of get a little bit of a big head. There's an episode called Ace of Squares in which Craig finally beats the ace in Foursquare, Tomon, who originally made the game really like hard and like, complicated to play, and Craig is given a lot of praise, but once he starts to realize that people treat him like competition even outside of the game, he immediately switches gears, and the next day when everybody's playing Foursquare, he is ruthless. He's not letting anybody win. He's not letting anyone have any fun. Even his own friends, Kelsey and JP, both get really upset because they thought that Craig's initial goal when getting the A square was to make it more fun, because that's what he had said. He wanted to take over from Toman because Toman made the game so hard and like just not fun to play, but Craig ends up doing the exact same thing. And it isn't until the end of the episode when Craig finally like gets down to like the last person playing with him, and he just like throws away all the rules that he had set up for the game and just plays normal Foursquare, and he loses. And from then on he apologizes to Kelsey and JP. But there's so many other examples throughout the show where Craig kind of just gets a big head from certain events, either because he did something really heroic or he's just trying to like gain some like form of like recognition or attention for his talents, and he just kind of is kind of rude to his friends. And at the end of every episode he like learns his lesson and he apologizes, but it's like kind of a common thing that happens with him, which I think is really funny. But whether or not Craig is like being a little selfish or being really there's a word I want to say but I can't say it. You know what I was gonna say. But whether or not he's like being really rude, at the end of the day Craig is really like outside to play with his friends, and he like wants them to have a good time. And even though it can get away from him at sometimes, at the end of the day he always bounces back. But another thing about Craig is he's extremely crafty. Throughout the show he shows like a very big interest in like engineering, and he gets that from his grandfather. His grandfather is like basically a handyman. He builds and does so many different things, and Craig really admires him. And throughout the show Craig makes like different inventions or like gadgets to like help like him and his friends when they're doing certain things for different episodes. But he's also known for his map. Craig has an entire master map of the creek and the neighborhood. Ooh, I'm sorry, that sound, that little I'm sorry, that was nasty. Y'all didn't need to hear that. But anyway, what was I saying? Sorry. Craig has a hand-drawn map of the creek and his neighborhood. The map plays like a significant role throughout the show, but it's most significant to Craig. Craig is extremely sentimental. Each landmark, each new fold, each new addition to the map is like a documented memory. He really cherishes his time with Kelsey and JP, which is why when the notion that they may not always be friends comes up, Craig does not respond well at all. There's one final episode I want to ask about. There's one final episode I want to talk about, and that is Evolution of Craig. This is probably like one of my favorite episodes in the entire show. It follows Craig and a tadpole he caught with his grandfather after walking home together from the library. Over the course of a few days, the tadpole begins a rapid physical metamorphosis as it's becoming a frog, while Craig begins a slower, more chaotic mental metamorphosis, during which Craig begins to project his own insecurities and fears about aging and change on the tadpole. Craig and his grandfather were originally at the library because he had to pick up a book for summer reading because Craig is going into the 5th grade. And just the entire episode kind of follows Craig as he gets sent down like a mental spiral about growing up and what that means for like him and his relationships. His main concern is whether or not he, Kelsey, and JP will stay friends as they grow up. There's an amazingly animated scene where Craig fantasizes his friends turning on him because he's grown up. While the scene for the most part is like for comedic effect and is pretty entertaining, the underlying like message and feelings that this 9-year-old is having is terrifying. So much so that he literally like falls back off the chair in his kitchen is like fully on his back, hyperventilating. It's really sad to watch. But Craig's tadpole is making progress on becoming a frog. He and his grandfather have been making calls back and forth and made a deal that once it's a fully grown frog, they'll release him back to the wild. But with Craig still deep in an existential spiral, when the frog is finally ready to be released, he is not ready to let it go because he's not really ready to let a part of himself go. Luckily, the episode ends on a high note. Craig's grandpa reassures him that change is a part of life and that growing up doesn't mean that he has to lose a part of himself to do it. Craig is truly just such a well-rounded character, and I'm so glad that there are young black boys that can watch him and resonate with him like I did. Craig the Creek is truly just such an amazing show, and it's, again, just one of my favorites, and I think it's really a masterclass when it comes to representation. When I tell you there's so many more characters in this show that are so memorable and accurately represent so many different groups and communities in a way that I haven't really seen in a long time, it's incredible. And I think there's so many more characters I could have talked about, but I chose to whittle it down to just our 3 main characters because there's so much from them. But trust me, if you do end up watching this show because of me, I hope that you also get to see just how many more people are represented, and I hope you get to see yourself represented in that show because it's truly so good. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our first ever episode of Tunes, Tunes, and Issues. Did you guys enjoy it? I know I did. I don't have too many friends who I can like talk to about like cartoons, comic books, and all that nerdy stuff, so it's nice to kind of just have like a little mouthpiece where I could just rant and spew all my guts out about the things that I really like to the ether, and just hope that there's people who enjoy it who might also feel the same way. But if you're interested in keeping up with this podcast, you can listen to this every Friday at 7 p.m. here on WCRX, or you can follow Tunes, Tunes, and Issues on Spotify and hopefully Apple Music. They aren't posted yet, but they will be soon. To get updates on the show, you can follow our Instagram at Tunes Toons Issues, TUNESTOONSISSUES. Long username, I know, but please follow it if you're interested in keeping up with me in the show. Well, this has been fun, but I am your resident Blerd, Avery, and you're listening to WCRX.